The house was always cold. Not just in temperature, but in a way that seeped into your bones, a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Alina had learned to wear an extra layer under her uniform, not for warmth, but as a shield against the emptiness. She moved through the sprawling mansion like a ghost, her footsteps silent on the thick, cream-colored carpets that seemed to swallow sound. Her days were measured in the scent of lemon polish, the soft whisk of a feather duster, and the rhythmic hum of the air conditioning, which was the only thing that truly seemed to live here. It was the sound of a house breathing, but it was a mechanical, soulless breath. This was the world of Mr. Sterling, a man whose name was often whispered in the same sentence as words like empire and fortune. He was a titan, a man who built skyscrapers and shaped cityscapes. But in his own home, he was just a shadow, a fleeting presence who left the scent of expensive coffee and a faint trail of unrest in his wake. He had built this house for his family, but now it was just a monument to what he had lost. 2 years ago, his wife had been gone, and in her absence, the life had been sucked out of the walls and hallways. In her grief, or perhaps in his helplessness, Mr. Sterling had tried to fill the void with things. He bought art that no one looked at, furniture that was never sat on, and technology that was never used. The house was a perfect, gleaming museum to a life that no longer existed. And at the center of it all, like the heart in a body that refused to beat, was his 10-year-old son. Alina saw the boy more than anyone. She saw him in the mornings, a small, silent figure standing at the top of the grand staircase, his hand resting on the cool, polished banister. He was blind, had been since birth, and he navigated his world by memory and touch. But since his mother's passing, he had withdrawn into himself so completely that it seemed he was trying to erase his other senses as well. He was a prisoner in his own darkness, and he had chosen to make the cell as silent as possible. He didn't speak. He barely made a sound. He would drift through the rooms, a lonely astronaut floating in the cold expanse of space, his face a mask of sullen frustration that never seemed to leave him. Elena's heart ached for him. She had seen children before, noisy, messy bundles of energy and joy. Leo was the opposite. He was a tightly wound knot of grief and anger, and he had no way to unravel it. He would run his hands along the walls, not exploring, but as if testing the boundaries of his cage. Sometimes she would find him standing in a room perfectly still, for so long that she'd think he was a statue. He was waiting, she thought, for a sound that would never come again. The most painful object in the entire house was a sleek, black grand piano that sat in the center of the living room. It was a beautiful instrument, all gleaming lacquer and graceful curves. With ivory keys that looked like perfect, untouched teeth. Mr. Sterling had bought it a year after his wife died. He'd told a housekeeper once, in a rare moment of vulnerability, that his wife had loved music. He thought maybe Leo would too. Maybe the piano could be a bridge, a way for his son to express what he couldn't say. But Leo had never touched it, not once. The piano had become the symbol of his father's failed attempt to connect him. Polished, silent tombstone to a hope that had died before it was even born. Alina would dust it every week, wiping away invisible fingerprints from a surface that was never touched. And the silence of it felt like an accusation. Alina understood silence better than most. Before her life had taken a desperate turn. She had been a student at a music conservatory, promising young pianist who could make the keys sing. Music had been her language. But then her father got sick. The medical bills piled up and the dream had to be put away. The conservatory was replaced with long hours cleaning other people's houses, and her piano was replaced by a vacuum cleaner. She missed it with a physical ache, a phantom limb that she could still feel. She missed the way a chord could vibrate through your whole body, the way a melody could tell a story without a single word. In the Sterling silent house, the absence of music was almost deafening. One Tuesday afternoon, the routine was broken. Alina was in the library, carefully wiping down the spines of leather-bound books that no one ever read, when a sound ripped through the thick quiet. It was a violent, angry noise. A harsh, discordant plinking that came from the living room. It wasn't music. It was a scream made of sound. She froze, her duster poised in midair. Another angry blast of notes followed, so full of frustration that it made her flinch. She put down her supplies and walked quietly towards the sound, her soft-soled shoes making no noise on the carpet. Peeking around the heavy oak doorframe, she saw him. It was Leo, standing on a small stool to reach the keys. His small hands were balled into tiny fists, and he was slamming them down on the ivory not to create a melody, but to create a noise loud enough to fight back against the immense, crushing silence of the house. Each impact was a punch thrown at his world. His face was scrunched up, his brow furrowed, and a single, angry tear traced a path down his cheek. He wasn't playing the piano. He was attacking it. He was using it as a weapon, as the only thing in this whole sterile place that would give him a loud, ugly voice. Elena's heart broke into a million pieces. She saw past the spoiled rich kid, past the difficult, silent boy. She saw a trapped soul, a bird beating its wings against the bars of its cage. She saw the same desperation she had felt when she had to walk away from her own dreams. In that angry, chaotic noise, she heard a cry for help that was so clear it was as if he had shouted the words. He was trying to make anything real in a world that felt hollow and fake. He wanted to feel a vibration, to hear a sound that was his own. Not the hum of the air conditioning or the drone of the television his father left on for company. She stood there, hidden in the shadows of the hallway, and just watched him. She watched the way his whole body tensed with each blow, the slight tremble in his shoulders as he paused to catch his breath. He was exhausted, but he wouldn't stop. It was as if this noise was the only thing keeping him from disappearing completely. And in that moment, watching this small blind boy wage his silent war against a world of silence and darkness, something shifted inside of Elena. A memory surfaced. Of herself as a little girl, frustrated with a difficult piece of music, slamming her own hands on the keys of her second-hand upright piano. She remembered her teacher, a kind old woman who had not scolded her. Instead, she had taken her hands, uncurled her fingers, and shown her how to turn the anger into power, the frustration into passion. She had shown her that even the saddest, most angry songs had a rhythm, a heartbeat. Looking at Leo, a silent promise formed in Elena's heart, strong and unwavering. She couldn't bring back his mother. She couldn't give him his sight, but she could give him this. She could give him the language she had lost. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that she had to help him turn his screams into a song. It was a crazy idea, a dangerous risk. She had no business getting involved, no right to interfere. But as she watched another tear fall on the polished black wood of the piano, she knew she had no choice. The house was silent, but she was going to teach that boy how to make it sing. The promise she had made to herself felt like a secret seed planted in her heart, and now she had to find a way to let it grow. The next day, Elena went through her morning chores with a new kind of nervous energy, her hands cleaning and polishing on autopilot while her mind rehearsed a scene that had no words. She knew that if she walked up to Leo and spoke to him, he would shrink away. His silence was a fortress, and words were cannonballs. She couldn't storm the castle. She had to find a way to be invited inside. She watched and waited. It was late afternoon when she saw him drift into the living room, drawn like a moth to the black, silent monument of the piano. He didn't touch it today. He just stood a few feet away, his head tilted, as if he was listening for the ghost of the noise he had made yesterday. The sun cast long golden rectangles across the floor, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air like tiny fairies. This was her moment. Elena took a slow, quiet breath and moved. She didn't walk directly towards him. Instead, she approached the piano from the side. Her movements deliberate and gentle, as if she was approaching a shy, wild animal in the forest. She began to dust the polished surface, her soft cloth making a quiet, whispering sound. Leo didn't move, but she could feel the shift in his attention. He was aware of her. She continued her work, her eyes focused on her hands, letting him get used to her presence. She dusted the sturdy legs, the curved side, and then she was standing beside the keyboard. So close she could feel the warmth coming from his small body, she stopped dusting. The silence in the room was different now. It was no longer empty, but filled with a tense, humming anticipation. Her heart was beating so loudly she was sure he could hear it. Slowly, carefully, she reached out her hand, not towards the piano, but towards him. Her fingers hovered just above his for a second before she gently took his small, clenched fist. He flinched, a full-bodied jolt of surprise, and tried to pull away, but she didn't let go. She didn't squeeze or hold him tight. She simply enveloped his hand in hers, a warm, soft pressure that said, "I'm not going to hurt you." He froze, his muscles tight with uncertainty. Elena didn't speak. She just stood there, holding his hand, a silent offering. After a long moment, she felt the tiniest bit of tension leave his fingers. He was letting her stay. Emboldened, she gently uncurled his fist, one finger at a time, until his palm was open against hers. Then, with the utmost care, she guided his hand to rest on the cool, smooth ivory of the keys. She placed his index finger on a single key, a C in the middle of the keyboard. He didn't press it. He just let his finger rest there, a question mark in the stillness. Elena had an idea. She didn't want to be the one to make the sound. The discovery had to be his. So, with her other hand, she began to tap a simple, steady rhythm on the back of his hand. Tap, 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 a slow, even beat, like a calm heartbeat. Leo's head tilted, his focus entirely on the feeling of her fingers drumming against his skin. He was listening with his sense of touch. She kept the rhythm steady, a quiet anchor in the sea of silence. Then she took his hand again, her hand over his, and she guided his finger to press down on the key. A single, clear note hung in the air. It wasn't the angry slam of yesterday. It was a pure, simple sound. A vibration thrummed through his finger, up his arm, and into his chest. He could feel it. A little gasp escaped his lips, a sound of pure astonishment. He pulled his hand back as if shocked, then hesitantly reached out and touched the key again, pressing it by himself. The note sang out once more. He did it again and again. A scientist conducting an experiment, a repeatable miracle. This became their secret ritual. Each afternoon, while the world outside the mansion rushed by, Elena and Leo would meet at the piano. It was a silent language they were inventing together. She would show him a rhythm by tapping it on his hand or his arm. He would learn it, his brow furrowed in concentration, and then he would find the rhythm on the keys. She found that if she traced the shape of a simple melody on his forearm, he could understand it. A slow, gentle curve was a smooth, flowing line of music. A sharp zigzag was a series of quick, lively notes. He learned to read her finger like he was reading Braille for music. It was a slow, delicate process. Some days he was frustrated. He would slam his hands down in a small burst of anger, and Elena would wait patiently, letting the storm pass, before gently taking his hand and showing him the quiet vibration of a single note again. She never scolded him, never showed any impatience. She simply held the space for him, calm and steady presence. She used what little money she had to buy small, textured stickers from a craft store. They were simple dots, some felt, some a bit like sandpaper. She carefully placed a felt on middle C. She put a rougher dot on the F, another one on the G. They were tiny signposts in the vast landscape of the keyboard, giving his fingers a map to follow. He learned their texture instantly. His fingers would dance from the soft 2 to the rough dot, finding his way without his eyes. This was his world, a world he could navigate with confidence. In this quiet exchange, a bond was forged that was deeper than any words could have created. For Elena, it was like finding a part of herself she thought was gone forever. The dusty, forgotten rooms of the mansion faded away. And she was back in the conservatory, but this time the music was more than just notes on a page. It was a bridge. It was a key unlocking a door for a lonely little boy. The joy she felt when he successfully played a simple 5-note melody was overwhelming, a pure, unadulterated happiness that she hadn't felt in years. She began to see a change in him. The angry, sullen mask he wore started to soften. The permanent crease between his eyebrows smoothed out. When he focused on the piano, his face was no longer hard and tight, but open and serene. He started to carry himself differently. His steps became a little lighter, a little more purposeful. The silence he was so fiercely protective of was changing too. It was no longer a wall, but a cocoon. It was the space where their unique communication could happen. A space filled with unspoken understanding and the shared pulse of the music. One afternoon, they had been working on a simple nursery rhyme, something with a happy, bouncy rhythm. Alina had tapped the rhythm on his knee, and then guided his hands to the starting position. He played it through one note at a time, his fingers finding their way from one textured dot to the next. When he finished the last note, he didn't stop. A tiny sound came from him, a quiet hum. It was the melody he had just played, a soft, breathy echo of the notes still hanging in the air. Alina's breath caught in her throat. It was the first time she had ever heard him make a musical sound. She didn't move, barely dared to breathe, afraid to break the spell. He took another breath and hummed it again, a little louder this time, a little more confident. He was beginning to find his own voice, not in words, but in melody. He was turning the silence into something beautiful, all by himself. And Alina knew, with a certainty that filled her entire being, that this was just the beginning. The silent house was finally starting to sing. Change was a subtle current in the still waters of the Sterling household. And Alistair Sterling was a man who noticed currents, especially when they disturbed the familiar surface of his world. At first, the changes were so small, they were almost unnoticeable, like the slow shifting of shadows as the sun moves across the sky. But Alistair was a creature of habit and pattern, a man who built his life on logic and predictability, and any deviation, no matter how small, registered on his internal radar. The first thing he noticed was the silence itself. It was still there, the great vaulted quiet of the mansion, but it was different. It wasn't the oppressive, heavy silence of a tomb anymore. It felt ... lighter. It was a silence that held a potential, a quiet energy that seemed to hum just beneath the surface. It was the difference between an empty, abandoned house and a house where everyone is sleeping. There was life there, even if it was quiet. Then he started to notice it in his son. Leo had always moved through the house with a certain heaviness, slumped, defeated posture that spoke volumes about his inner world. He was a boy weighed down by an invisible burden. But lately, his walk had changed. There was a new, almost imperceptible spring in his step. He didn't just shuffle from one room to the next. He moved with a sense of purpose, a destination in mind. Alistair would see him coming down the grand staircase, his hand sliding confidently along the banister, his head held a little higher. He wasn't just drifting anymore. He was moving. One evening, Alistair came home late after a grueling day of board meetings and negotiations. The house was dimly lit, as usual, with only a few lamps casting warm pools of light in the cavernous rooms. He poured himself a drink and sank into one of the stiff, expensive armchairs in the living room. He was scrolling through messages on his phone when he heard it. It was so faint he thought he must have imagined it. It was a soft, almost inaudible humming sound. He looked up, his eyes sharp and searching. There was Leo, standing by the large window, looking out at the darkened gardens. He wasn't just standing there. He was swaying slightly, back and forth, and the low, gentle hum was coming from him. It wasn't a sad sound. It was a tune, a simple, happy melody that he seemed to be lost in. Alistair sat frozen, his drink forgotten in his hand. He hadn't heard his son make a sound like that, a sound of simple, uncomplicated contentment. In years, the next morning, the change was even more obvious. As Leo passed him in the hallway on his way to the kitchen, a small, genuine smile touched his lips. It wasn't the forced, polite smile he sometimes gave at a command. It was fleeting and real, a glimpse of the happy boy he might have been. Alistair felt a strange pang in his chest, a mixture of joy and a sharp, unfamiliar feeling he couldn't quite name. It was guilt. He was happy to see his son smile, but he had no idea why. He had not been the cause of it. His mind, a finely tuned instrument of analysis and suspicion, began to work. He was a businessman, and in his world, things didn't just change without a reason. There was always a cause and effect, a variable that had been introduced to the equation. What was the variable? He hadn't done anything differently. He was still distant, still buried in his work, still unable to break through the wall of his own grief and his son's silence. So, someone else must have. He questioned the head housekeeper, a stern, efficient woman who had been with the family for years and knew every detail of the household's running. "Is everything all right with Leo?" he asked, trying to sound casual as he fixed his tie. The woman, whose name was Margaret, paused in her task of arranging flowers. "The boy seems quite well, Mr. Sterling. In fact, he's been spending a great deal of time in the living room." Alistair's brow furrowed. "The living room? Doing what?" "Just being there," Margaret said with a slight shrug. "He seems very calm. He'll sit on the stool by the piano for a while. He hasn't touched it, of course. Just sits." The piano. The word struck a chord of unease in him. He had bought that piano as a desperate gesture, a lifeline he had thrown into the dark water of his son's world, and it had sunk without a trace. He had almost forgotten about it. He walked into the living room later that day, his eyes sweeping over the scene. Everything was in its perfect, dust-free place, exactly as it should be. But as he got closer to the grand piano, he saw it. The pristine, gleaming surface had a different quality. It held a faint, almost invisible warmth, and when he leaned down, he saw the tiniest, faintest indentations on the ivory keys. Not the clean, untouched keys of a museum piece, but the soft, subtle marks of being played. They were so faint, he might have missed them if he wasn't looking so closely. Someone was playing his piano. Someone was touching his son. A cold knot of dread tightened in his stomach. He felt a surge of protectiveness, a primal instinct that warred with his businesslike paranoia. Who was it? Had he hired a new music therapist without being told? A specialist? He paid a small fortune for a team of people to manage Leo's care. A team that had, up until now, produced absolutely no results. Had one of them finally broken through? And why hadn't he been informed? Or worse, his mind whispered, what if it was someone unauthorized? A stranger, someone taking advantage of his absence, meddling in his son's life. The thought of an unknown person in his house forming a bond with his vulnerable, silent child made his skin crawl. He felt like a king who had been so busy ruling his kingdom that he hadn't noticed someone else was raising the prince. This was his house. This was his son. And he was being kept in the dark, an outsider in his own family. The feeling of being excluded, of being a failure as a father, was a bitter pill to swallow. He immediately started running through the staff in his head. The cook? Unlikely. The gardeners? No, it had to be someone inside, someone with daily access. His eyes scanned the list of employees in his mind. They landed on the quiet maid. Alina, she was new, having started a few months ago. She was always in the background, a silent, efficient presence. He barely noticed her. Was she the one? It seemed impossible. What would a maid know about teaching music? What could she possibly have to offer his son? Yet she was always there, always in the house, dusting the very room where these changes seemed to be centered. The thought was both ridiculous and deeply unsettling. He couldn't shake it. The idea of this unassuming woman, an employee, reaching his son in a way he never could, felt like a profound violation. It was a crack in the carefully constructed walls of his life. He had to know. He had to see it for himself. He made a decision. The next day, he would cancel his afternoon meetings. He would come home early, without telling anyone. He would walk into his house unannounced, a ghost in his own home, and he would uncover the secret. He would find the person who had dared to cross the line, the person who had changed his son without his permission. He didn't know what he would do when he found them, but he knew one thing for certain. This silent experiment was about to come to a very loud, very abrupt end. He was no longer just a worried father. He was a CEO reclaiming control of his most important asset, and he was ready for a confrontation. The next afternoon, Alistair Sterling's world was about to be turned upside down, and he was the one holding it by the ankles. He had canceled his appointments, telling his assistant it was a family matter, a phrase he hadn't used in years. He drove his own car home, a rare occurrence that felt both strange and strangely right. As he turned onto the tree-lined street of his neighborhood, His hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. He felt like a detective approaching a suspect's hideout. His senses heightened, his mind running through every possible scenario. He didn't know what he expected to find, but he was ready for a fight, for a confrontation. He was ready to reassert his authority as the master of his house and the father of his son. He parked in the circular driveway, not in his usual spot in the multi-car garage. He wanted to be unseen. As he approached the grand front door, he fumbled for his keys. A mundane action that suddenly felt clandestine and fraught with tension. He chose the key he rarely used, the one for the front entrance, a heavy, ornate piece of metal that felt cold and final in his hand. He inserted it into the lock, the sound of the tumblers turning unnaturally loud in the quiet afternoon air. With a deep breath, he pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped inside. The moment he crossed the threshold, he froze. The air was different. The usual sterile silence was gone, replaced by something so beautiful, so alive, that it rooted him to the spot. It was music. Not the simple, hesitant plinking he might have expected from a beginner. It was a melody of breathtaking complexity and emotion. A cascade of notes flowed from the living room, a piece filled with a deep, poignant longing, yet underpinned by a thread of delicate strength. It was Chopin, a composer he vaguely remembered his wife adored. The sound was not loud, but it filled every corner of the vast house, chasing away the shadows and the cold. It was as if the house was finally taking its first real breath. He stood there for a full minute, just listening, his mind struggling to process what he was hearing. This music was not the sound of a child fumbling with a new toy. It was the sound of a soul speaking, a voice that had been found and was now pouring out its heart. And in that moment, the hard, suspicious shell he had built around himself began to crack. He wasn't thinking about trespassing or overstepping employees. He was simply a man, standing in his own home. Listening to a beauty he hadn't known was possible, he followed the sound, his feet moving slowly, almost reverently, across the marble floor of the foyer. He felt like an intruder, a trespasser, in this sacred new world that had blossomed in his absence. As he reached the archway of the living room, the music swelled, and the scene before him stopped his heart completely. There, at the grand piano, sat his son Leo. He was on the small stool, his posture straight, his body swaying gently with the music. His eyes were closed, his face a perfect portrait of concentration and peace. He was not fighting the piano anymore. He was one with it. His small hands, the same hands that had once slammed down in anger, now moved with an intuitive grace across the keys. They danced and flew, coaxing the intricate, heartbreaking melody from the instrument. It was the most beautiful thing Alistair had ever seen, and standing right beside him, body leaning into his, her own focus absolute, was Alina, the quiet maid. She wasn't just standing there. She was a part of the music. One of her hands rested gently on Leo's shoulder, a steady, reassuring presence. The other hand was tracing a pattern on his forearm, her fingers moving in time with the melody he was playing, guiding him, shaping the music, whispering the next phrase into his skin. Her face was not that of a servant, but of a mentor, an artist, a soul sharing its deepest gift. The expression on her face was one of serene, profound focus. A look of such tenderness and connection that it made Alistair's chest ache. It was an intimate, sacred moment, silent conversation between two people who had created a language of their own. Alistair watched. Unseen in the shadows of the hallway, and the anger and suspicion that had driven him home began to melt away, replaced by a wave of emotion so powerful he could barely stand it. He saw not a maid crossing a line, but a woman who had seen a broken little boy and had used her own broken dreams to piece him back together. He saw the person who had accomplished what all his money, his therapists, and his own grief-stricken efforts had failed to do. She hadn't just taught his son to play the piano. She had given him back his voice, but just as this wave of understanding was about to wash over him completely, the old ingrained instincts of the Titan, the CEO, the protector, roared back to life. He was still the man who controlled everything. And this entire scene had happened without his knowledge, without his permission. The feeling of being an outsider in his own son's life, of having been so completely shut out, was a bitter, burning shame. And shame, for a man like Alistair Sterling, was often looked a lot like anger. He took a deep breath. The sound of his own inhalation, loud and harsh in the delicate musical air. He stepped out of the shadows and into the room, his presence an immediate, violent disruption. What is the meaning of this? His voice was not loud, but it was filled with an icy authority that cut through the melody like a shard of glass. The music died instantly. The final note hanging in the air for a moment before being swallowed by the sudden, suffocating silence. The abrupt end was so shocking it felt like a physical blow. Leo flinched as if he had been struck, his whole body tensing. The peaceful expression on his face vanished, replaced by a mask of pure terror. Alina jumped back as if she'd been electrocuted, her hands flying to her chest. Her face, which had been so serene a moment before, was now a canvas of stark, white fear. Her eyes were wide with panic, darting from the boy beside her to the man looming over them. The look on her face was one of utter terror. The terror of someone caught doing something beautiful in a world ruled by cold, hard rules. "Dad?" Leo whispered, his voice trembling so badly he could barely get the word out. He turned his head blindly toward the source of the voice, his small hands frozen in midair above the keys. She was just ... He couldn't finish. The fear had stolen his breath and his newfound voice. Alistair ignored his son. His glare was fixed on Alina, his eyes cold and unfeeling. He saw the uniform, the apron. He saw an employee who had forgotten her place. He saw a trespasser touching his son, touching his property, acting as if she belonged in this world of polished wood and priceless art. He saw the person who had made him feel like a failure, and a part of him wanted to crush her for it. "You were paid to clean this house," he said, his voice dangerously low and precise. "Not to touch my son. Not to touch my belongings." He took a step closer, his large frame casting a shadow over both of them. "Explain yourself." The words were not a question. They were a command, a death sentence delivered in a quiet, menacing tone. The room so full of life just moments before was now a tomb, and he had just sealed the door. The silence that followed Alistair's words was heavier and more suffocating than any silence the house had ever held before. It was a silence filled with dread, with the sharp, metallic taste of fear. Alina stood rooted to the spot, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to apologize, to beg for forgiveness. Her mind was a chaotic storm of consequences. She could lose her job, her only source of income for her family back home. She could be fired, evicted from her small room, reported, and sent away with nothing. The life she had painstakingly built, the small, fragile stability she had found, could be shattered in an instant, all because she had followed her heart. Her throat was dry. Her tongue felt thick and useless. She opened her mouth to speak, to stammer out some kind of desperate explanation, but no sound would come. But before she could force the words out, another voice broke the terrible stillness. It was a voice that had been silent for so long, a voice that had only just begun to find its melody, and now it rose, not in a song, but in a desperate, raw plea. "She's teaching me, Dad. Don't fire her?" It was Leo. He had pushed himself up from the piano stool and was standing between his father and Alina, a small, blind boy trying to be a shield. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, his whole body trembling, but his voice, though shaking with fear, was clear and loud in the cavernous room. This was not the quiet hum she had heard before. This was a shout from the depths of his soul. "Please don't fire her," he begged, his face turned towards his father's voice, tears now streaming freely down his cheeks. "She's been teaching me for weeks, but we do it in silence, because the noise hurts my head sometimes. She didn't want to bother you." Took a shaky breath, the words tumbling out in a rush, a story he had been holding inside for so long. "She teaches me with her hands. With touch. She doesn't talk, and that's okay. She understands." He reached behind him, his hand searching, and found Elena's. He clutched it, his small fingers wrapping around hers with a desperate strength. "She understands me," he choked out, and that final sentence was a sob. The purest, most honest declaration he could make, seeing his son's impassioned defense. Seeing the raw, naked emotion on his face, Alistair Sterling felt something inside him shift. It was a seismic rumbling that cracked the foundation of his anger and his authority. For a moment, he saw not a disobedient employee, but the woman who had inspired this loyalty, this courage, in his own child. He saw his son not as a silent problem to be managed, but as a passionate, feeling human being who had found a connection he had been desperately starving for. Alina, feeling Leo's hand in hers, found her own courage. The boy was braver than she was. He was fighting for her, and she could not let him stand alone. She squeezed his hand gently, a silent promise, and then she spoke, her voice soft and shaking, but clear. "Mr. Sterling, I am so sorry," she began, her eyes fixed on the floor, unable to meet his piercing gaze. "I understand your anger. It was my fault. I used to study music when I was young, before life changed." She swallowed hard, the memory still painful. "I saw his frustration with the piano that day, and I knew how he felt. I wanted to help. It was my idea. Please, don't blame him. He is the most wonderful student." Alistair stood there, a giant of a man, frozen under the weight of their words. He looked from the terrified maid to his passionately defiant son. He listened to her simple, heartfelt explanation. And he saw not a scheming trespasser, but a woman who had seen a wound and, with her own pain, had known exactly how to tend to it. He saw a person who had looked at his son and not seen a difficult case or a symbol of a broken family, but a boy who needed a friend. She hadn't asked for money or recognition. She had done it simply because she could. The wall of ice around his heart, a wall he had spent years building to protect himself from his own grief and guilt, finally shattered. The realization crashed down on him with an overwhelming force. He was the one who was sorry. He was the one who had failed. He had filled this house with things, with professionals, every resource money could buy, but he had never given his son the one thing he truly needed: his time, his presence, his heart. He had been so focused on building an empire that he had neglected to build a home. He had been so busy mourning his wife that he had forgotten to be a father. He walked slowly, deliberately, towards the piano. His movements were no longer predatory, but heavy with the weight of his regret. He looked at the keys, where Leo's small hands had just been. He could still feel the faint warmth of the music that had filled the room. Then he looked at Alina, truly looked at her for the first time. He saw the fear in her eyes, but beneath it, he saw a deep, unshakable compassion. "I am the one who is sorry," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. The words were hoarse, as if they were scraping their way out of a long-closed door. He turned his full attention to his son, kneeling down so he was at his level. "I am so sorry, Leo," he said, his voice cracking. He reached out and gently placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "I am so sorry I wasn't listening. I wasn't here." Leo's sob quieted, and he tentatively reached out his free hand, his fingers finding his father's face, tracing the line of his jaw, a habit he used to know people. Alistair didn't pull away. He let his son see him, truly see him, for perhaps the first time in a very long time. Then, Alistair stood back up and looked at Alina. The hard, cold mask was completely gone, replaced by a look of profound gratitude and humility. "Alina," he began, his voice now steady and clear, "what I said was unforgivable. Can you ever forgive me?" Alina could only nod, tears welling in her own eyes, relief and disbelief washing over her in a warm wave. "No," Alistair continued, shaking his head. "That is not enough. You have given my son a gift that is beyond price. You have given him back his voice. He made a decision right there, a decision that would change the course of all their lives. I am not going to fire you. I would be honored if you would stay, but not as my maid." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I want you to be Leo's full-time teacher and his companion. We will pay for you to finish your music education, to get your degree. We will find the best tutors. It is the very least I can do. It is my privilege to do this for you." The silence that had once defined the house was gone forever. In its place was a new sound, the sound of healing. In the weeks and months that followed, the mansion was transformed. The grand piano was no longer a monument, but the living, beating heart of the home. Alistair made it a point to be there for Leo's lessons every afternoon. He would sit in his armchair, not on his phone or with a drink, but simply listening. He learned to read music by watching Elena's hands on Leo's arm. He learned to feel the rhythm of the music in the floorboards. Elena was no longer a ghost in the home. She was a cherished friend, a member of the family. She enrolled in an online university program, and sometimes in the evenings, after Leo was in bed, Alistair would sit with her at the kitchen table, helping her with her music theory homework. A titan of industry, learning the basics of a world he had never understood. One evening, the three of them were in the living room. The fire was crackling, and there was a comfortable, easy warmth in the air. Leo sat at the piano, his back straight, his hands poised. He turned to his father and Elena, a bright, confident smile on his face. "I wrote something," he said. "For you both." He began to play. It was a new composition, a simple melody that started out soft and hesitant, like a question, then grew stronger and more complex. Filled with twists and turns of sadness and joy, it was a story, a song of gratitude and hope, a melody born from silence, nurtured by a kind heart, and finally shared in perfect harmony. And as Alistair sat there listening to his son's music, with the woman who had saved them both sitting by his side, he finally understood that the most valuable things in life cannot be bought. They can only be heard, felt, and shared from one heart to another.